Hey everybody, welcome back to another video with Ash, also known as My Name is Mud by Ash. If you're one of my students, you just saw the demonstration of bowls this past week. And I did make a video. This is going to be a two-part video though, because I also did a lecture, which I'm doing again right now, and I'm going to fuse it with the demonstration video. So the reason why I wanted to do a lecture first before the demonstration, for several reasons, very important reasons you want to think about before you dive in with making bowls. All right. A big one is the shape of your bowl before you open. Okay. So if you think you want to make a bowl that is really wide, for example, and shallow. So in other words, if you were to cut it in half after you threw it all the way across from one side to the other, it would make a shape of a rectangle or close to it if it does have a curve, regardless of how exaggerated or narrow and rigid that curve is, okay? Such as a T-bowl, kind of like this one, all right? You would want the shape of that ball before you open it to be very close to the diameter, if not the same diameter that you want once you're done throwing that bowl and cut it off the wheel. Okay, so you'd want it to be, let's say we're on the topic of the rectangle, so like a T-bowl, shallow bowl. You would want your diameter or your width all the way across on your ball of clay to be something like a hockey puck or a tuna can. So it's much shorter in comparison to its diameter. It's much wider, right? That's one example. The other example about your shape of clay, if you want to have a fan shape of a bowl, so like an upside down trapezoid, close to a triangle, or even if it's not quite as narrow at the foot like my palms are right now, such as this bowl, okay? And your rim or your lip is much wider than the diameter in comparison, or maybe your foot is at least half the diameter of your lip, okay? It may not be as narrow as this one. Or if you want your bowl to have a flare, whether it's very subtle like this one, or a little bit more of an exaggerated flare like this one, right? The shape of the top of that ball of clay before you open it is also setting the framework and foundation for your rim and where you're going to take the top half of that wall after you open, okay? Now the next significant thing I want you to wrap your head around and think about is when you start to open. It's a little bit different than my previous video. So if you're one of my students, or you've found me on YouTube and you've watched my first video, it was very general, just going over the foundation. So when we opened, we started to form close to a 90-degree angle with our finger as we push straight down the center of that ball, right? With bowls, especially if you want to have a nice smooth curve from one end of your rim all the way down that wall, down to the interior of your foot, the bottom of the bowl, up to the next area of that rim, parallel. Or if you want it to be a little bit wider of a curve, or even flat, almost like a squared off interior foot, okay? Unless you do want a round or an oval, okay? When you start to open that ball of clay, you're still using the muscle in your fingertip to get that hole going, but you're not starting to come close to hooking your finger. You're actually going to keep an angle like this to help create the start of that interior curve. So if your bowl, for example, if you want it to be something like this, or even taller like this one, then yes, you might want to start to form close to that 90-degree angle. It may not be as rigid, but close, because as you start to open and you push that muscle in your fingertip down and start to use more of the tip of your finger as you get deeper into that ball of clay when you're opening, the rest of your finger from here closer to your palm is starting to form and support that curve that you want in your wall, so that you don't have to work it as much when you're pulling up that wall and finishing the shape. And you're less likely to create a weak spot at the bottom of that wall where it meets the foot, because that's leading me to the next big factor with throwing bowls and what bowls are a great teacher of, okay? When it comes to bowls, you're leaving a lot more clay, so therefore you're using more clay. You're leaving a lot of that clay down at the bottom, or more than you realize. It's not always a lot, because sometimes you want your foot to be shallow and short like this. Not everybody that throws on the wheel likes a tall, skinny foot like I do, or like this bowl here, okay? But hold on to that thought for 1 second. Coming back to opening, as you push your finger down, you're starting to form close to that curve on the inside of your wall, okay? So that you don't have to work it like I already noted earlier. And when you start to bring up your walls, you're starting from the center with your interior hand, and you're just following that curve so that you keep that curve, and you're less likely to make a lump in there. Once you do start to follow that lead with your dominant hand on the outside, and you're less likely to create a ring or a hump right in here, somewhere between the base, the inside of your foot, and halfway point of your wall, okay? Now, when you bring up your walls, you're gonna gently follow that curve, like I just said, with your interior hand, your non-dominant. And when you feel your hand from the inside meet your dominant hand, and it starts to go just above that, which is your dominant hand's on the outside right here at your foot, right? Then your dominant hand's gonna start to follow its lead. Okay, so your non-dominant's slightly above, and it's gonna follow its lead up that wall. And as you bring that clay up just a little bit at a time, so you don't want to start with a bunch of pressure, because you gotta think about the fact that I just mentioned. You want to leave a good chunk of that clay down at the bottom, because that clay at the bottom needs to support all the way, or all the weight above itself, okay? So with that said, if you want that bowl to come out wide in comparison to what you want the bottom to be, you're gonna want to leave more clay so that that clay at the bottom can support how wide you're bringing it out. But if you don't want your bowl to come out like a triangle and fan out, you want it to have a subtle curve, right? A gradual curve somewhere between the foot and halfway up the wall, let's say, for example. And then like this bowl, once it gets to that halfway point of the wall, it slows down. It goes more straight as it approaches the lip. Even if this lip had a subtle flare to it, like this one does the same thing with its wall. It curves out, and then it slows down with that flare, and then it flares out just a little bit more, okay? That's the other point, the important thing that you are learning with bowls. It's teaching you how to subtly and gracefully adjust your pressure point in your fingertips while you're bringing up your walls to get the shape that you want, okay? So you're gonna start with just touch with your inside hand, following that curve from the center. And when you meet your dominant on the outside of that foot and it just gets past it, you're gonna hold a little bit of tension and a gentle amount of pressure in that outside hand to follow its lead to bring up that walls and you can adjust your angles of your hands and your pressure point, because you're still releasing that little bit of pressure to make that clay taller, right? But you can shift gentle amounts of pressure in each hand or stabilize them. Equal pressure makes it straight, if you remember from that first demo, okay? So they are also a phenomenal teacher of thickness perception and depth perception, all right? So when you do get on the wheel and you start throwing, when you open, you want to definitely and quickly get into the habit of not opening as deep as what you maybe are already used to if you've done this before, okay? So it's better to be safe than sorry. You can always gently open it up a little bit deeper, but you don't want to end up making it too thin down there, all right? So, because like I said, you do need that, a lot of that clay at the bottom, all right? More than you're used to at this point. Now, also, let's say, coming back to opening, all right? If I want that bowl to be more rounded, right? I want the shape of that ball of clay to definitely be rounded as it approaches the top. So if it's, whether it's a subtle curve at the top, or I definitely want it to be a nice continuous curve from the foot to the lip. I want the top of that ball of clay to be a dome. Doesn't mean that where it's anchored to the wheel needs to be rounded just yet. You actually don't want that. You want it to be closer to square, if not a little bit flared where it's anchored to the wheel. So flared out a little bit for that support that I've been talking about this whole video, all right? Anything else? Did I forget anything? I made notes for you so I wouldn't forget anything. I think I did it. All right. Also, bowls are an awesome object to learn how to throw that teach you how to start using your tools to get the shape and object that you want to make. All right, so after a few pulls of your walls, when you're ready to refine it and define that shape, you want to start practicing using your rib tools. You'll see that also in the demonstration, which I believe we are now ready for. Don't forget to compress your rims, and don't forget to check the thickness of your of your feet when you're opening. And don't forget to leave more clay than what you think you're good with, since you're beginner at this. Leave more clay than you realize, and that's going to help you not only with thickness perception, depth perception, but also it's going to help you with trimming and learning that tactic. And as you do this in repetition, so the more you make, regardless of their shape, you'll refine that pressure points, those transitions as you play with shape and bringing up your walls, as well as your thickness perception. I believe I mentioned this in the demonstration video, but in case I didn't, bowls are also, and clay in general, especially wheel throwing, they're an excellent teacher with the thickness perception, because we add a lot of water to that clay as we're throwing. Now, as your piece sets up and dries, especially from when it's fresh wheel thrown to when it's completely bone dry, that thickness is going to go bye-bye, because that water is going to dry out and it's going to evaporate. So you're going to be surprised at how much you're going to learn the more you do this with that thickness perception, especially, okay, as your piece dries out. Your wall is going to be probably close to half the thickness, depending on how thin or thick you like to throw. You're going to lose a lot of water. Okay, so, but over time you'll refine that, as well as your thickness, your pressure points, and playing around with angles and transitioning your hands, and as well as how much water you use. Okay, and you'll learn the depth perception as well, especially with your feet, and once we start trimming. So stay tuned for the trimming demonstration as well. All right, I hope that was helpful. And now let's get started with the demonstration. Thanks for tuning in. Okay, so like I said, I already centered my ball of clay, and I've got relatively an equal diameter to my height. It's actually a little bit wider, but like I noted earlier, depending on that finished shape of your bowl is dependent on a close shape of what you want that centered ball of clay to be before you start opening it. So in other words, if I wanted this to be those shorter wide bowls that are closest to me on the table, I would want to make this ball a little bit shorter and wide, right? Because that, if I were to draw around this in 2D, this would be more rectangular, which is what those two bowls are, right? Rather than a fan, which is what a lot of those bowls are. If you want more of a curve along your wall, where it tapers out and then comes back in at the rim, that means that odds are you at least want that ball of clay to be equal its height with its diameter. You definitely want the top of it to be a dome rather than flat like those more rectangular bowls, right? Does that make sense? Okay, are you guys following me? Okay. How about you, Al?
Yeah.
Cool. Now, especially if I want one of those bowls that has a flared rim, even if it's subtle, right? Or like the black and brown one that's really got that exaggerated flared rim. The flared rim can be adjusted, especially the more exaggerated it comes out. That can be adjusted last before you cut that bowl off of the wheel. But the shape of that ball of clay, before you open it, helps with what shape you're after in the first place. So once you get that ball of clay centered, slow your wheel speed down a little bit. Now, if I wanted to do, and here's the tricky part, this would be a good challenge for you, but be careful if you do want to try this. If I want one of those wider bowls, even one of the taller ones that are much narrower at the foot and wider at the rim, as you open, you're holding a lot of tension in that non-dominant arm, but if you slowly start to follow your dominant hand that's opening that bowl of clay on the inside, and your non-dominant is slowly repositioning itself, holding a bunch of tension on the outside to not only support that ball of clay, but also start that exterior angle and curve that you want, okay? But you want to definitely be careful with that so that you don't accidentally push it off center or make the bottom too narrow, and then you can't make it as wide as you'd like without jeopardizing that whole piece. So when you're opening, you still want to use the muscle in your fingertip in the top center of that ball, but instead of just going straight down and holding a hard angle with your finger, try keeping your finger pointed straight out even though you're changing the angle of it, okay? So don't start to curve it. Does that make sense? All right. So that even though I'm applying pressure right here in the muscle of my fingertip, everywhere above that point and the rest of my finger is forming that interior curve that I want to start with the inside of that bowl. And as I push my finger down, I'm starting to get that curve. I don't know if you guys have already started to notice, but very gently, I'm starting to lean in with the bottom half of my left hand, down at the bottom. But if I don't want it to get too wide at the top, I just don't lean in too much, right? Because otherwise I am going to jeopardize the weight. And then gently slide your finger from the center. Follow that curve, but without really applying much pressure. So go up to your rim just to smooth out that interior curve. Now here's where bowls get really tricky. A lot of the time, the inside of that bowl, you're gonna have a lump, like right above the center point of the inside of your foot, okay? That lump is actually an indicator of where your dominant hand on the outside is applying pressure when you start bringing up that wall. Does that make sense? Maybe? Okay. So, compress your rim. Now I've got a really good thickness. If I put my fingers, like my thumb on the inside of the bottom and my index finger on the outside at the bat, I got a good thickness of clay down there. I'm not gonna bring all of that up, especially if I wanna go out and wide. The wider I wanna go, I should say. So, you want to have your non-dominant on the inside. Gently start to slide and push that clay very gently, following that curve you already have. And just like bringing up your walls, which is what you're doing, it just is a little bit different. My dominant hand on the outside is just holding tension to support that clay on the outside so I don't push it off center with my left on the inside. I'm slowly sliding my left up to that rim. And if I apply a little bit of pressure with my dominant hand on the outside at the foot, but I'm not gonna slide my right hand up just yet, the rest of my fingers and my right hand are going to support that bowl and help me get the shape that I want at the same time. So when I slowly start to apply pressure with my right fingertips on the outside of that foot and slide my left up the inside to bring that wall up very slowly and gradually, you'll start to make a very subtle ring down there at the bottom where your right fingertips are on the outside, or your dominant fingertips on the outside, supporting that clay and helping to push a little bit of that clay from the foot and back into your non-dominant hand. Now once you get a little bit of that clay from the base up into your wall, so I would say after 1 or 2 pulls with your non-dominant hand on the inside, then you can gently start to bring a little bit of clay up with both hands. But you see how that rim is wanting to get a little bit compromised, especially with it being so wide. This is going to help teach you not just the laws of gravity with clay, but also your pressure points and making the shape that you want. So if I did want this bowl to be wider than tall, right, I wouldn't have to worry about my dominant hand being on the outside to support so much of that while I start to get some of that thickness up, right? The other thing is if you want to start refining and defining that shape from here, it's going to help you refine that pressure point, because like I said in my first demo, when you start bringing up your walls, if you want your piece to get wider, it's more pressure in your non-dominant hand than it is in your dominant. The other hand is supporting that clay on the outside. Just like my right hand, my dominant hand was when I first started to bring up this wall with the bowl. But if you want to make your bowl have a little bit of a lip, for example, where it gently starts to come in a little bit and then flares out very subtly, or you want it to balance between a taper at the bottom and then go straight, then that means once you get past this, you have more even pressure as you continue up, right? So you're learning how to gently transition your pressure points rather than keeping them consistent with each other from top to bottom, even though you're slowly decreasing it as you slide your hands up. Are you guys following me? Does any of this make sense? Okay, I'm not losing you? Okay. But you see how, especially once I get past this point, as I continue up, trying to bring up that wall, it's wanting to get a little sensitive and overworked. Okay, so that brings me back to what I noted earlier before I started the demo and I was talking about all the examples. You want to leave that much more clay down at the bottom, especially if you are changing that kind of angle, and especially if you're getting wider at the top. Now this is also a good form to use for using your rib tools. So once you get this far, you can use either your wooden, especially your metal rib. Your metal rib is much more flexible, whereas your wooden one is not at all, right? So get it damp, hold it at a bevel angle to your piece. You don't want to hold it at a hard edge and bring it all the way up to like this edge to your piece, because you will snag that piece. Dip it in your bucket, start at the inside of your lip and slowly slide it down. Don't apply pressure through a tool unless you want to change the shape of your piece, but at this point that clay is so wet you will easily and quickly overwork it. So when you're using a rib, especially on the inside of a bowl, start with just touch before you try and venture into applying pressure. Now when it comes to bowls, I like to slide it down to the foot, slide it back up to make sure I don't have any lumps. And then they're also really good for compressing and shaping the kind of rim that you want, as well as giving your bowl not only some refinement, but some extra support on the outside, especially if it's needed, okay? And then go in with your sponge, smooth any of that out, take all of that extra water out of there, because you don't want your foot to crack while it's drying on the wear boards over the next week.